So, politics, political maps, power on a map. Political maps, as we learned in Unit 1, are made up of independent states with borders that have been shaped by the events of the past and physical geography. So independent states being places with a government and a legally defined border. As we saw yesterday, different political entities can include states, nations, and empires. Political power is something that governments hold. Governments have power over people in a given space. And that power is expressed geographically as control over people, land, and resources in a given territory. That means political power is all about who rules us and what they can do with the power that we give them or that they claim for themselves. Now, there are a lot of different ways to talk about politics and government and different configurations of power. And we're going to go through a bunch of them over the next couple of days. For now, we just want to get like a working vocabulary for politics and government that we're going to add on to tomorrow with lots of specific definitions. So first, I keep mentioning borders. Right, borders are actually pretty interesting things that you can see on a political map that have thousands of years of history behind them in most cases. Sometimes borders are really heavily shaped by physical geography. So like if you look at the picture on the left, you'll see a physical map of Asia, and it's pretty easy to find India on that map because its shape is outlined by mountain ranges. In that case, physical geography had a huge influence on the political borders of the state. On the right, you will see a map that hopefully it's moving on your end too, and it shows the growth of Chinese civilization literally over thousands of years. So you can see how that civilization kind of grew and filled into the modern day border of China, which is drawn for you on the map. So borders are all about like the physical layout and what that makes possible and the history behind it, right? Like what have people conquered? What land have people lost? That sort of thing. Okay. So we've talked about maps and borders. Now let's talk about government, rule over people. You can label this section of your notes Intro to Government. And right now what we are doing is building a little glossary. So these are words that are complicated. They are hard to understand the first time you hear them, but with lots of examples, you will eventually get a deep understanding of all of these terms. For now, please write them down so you can come back and reference them when we bring them up. And like I said, these are hard words. They're abstract. So it's okay if you don't fully get it today. You will eventually. That's my job. All right, so first off, government, what is it, right? Definitions. A government is a system of order that's made up of the people and institutions that exercise sovereign authority or control over a state. I mean, governments exist to provide order to society, to help it run. And they're composed of people, but also institutions, these like systems that we build over time that develop a life of their own. And they exercise sovereign, so like the highest control over a state. Governments are responsible for several functions. And when I take notes that sounds like it's going to be a list, usually I just put bullet points under a topic as a suggestion. You can take notes however you want, but that's how I do it. All right, so things that governments tend to do are enforcing laws, managing currency, so like the system of money, and protecting the population. especially from external threats, but also just generally. Different kinds of government do these things differently. So in some forms of government, government has a ton of power to just make laws themselves. Like absolute monarchy has a king who just can decide what the law is and says it, and that's what the law is. Other systems of government that are more democratic have people like vote to determine what laws are going to govern their behavior, or vote for representatives who then make those decisions. But generally, they make rules and they enforce them. They make sure that money is worth something, because if you look at a dollar bill, really it's like a piece of paper. And they protect us. That's the whole point. Without those three functions, like what do we need government for, man? Okay, the two harder concepts, and I'm just going to name that they're difficult to get at first, but you will get it eventually, I promise, are legitimacy and ideology. Legitimacy. When you write down this word, underline the part that says legit. Legitimacy is the right of a government to rule over its people as perceived by the people it rules over. That means the people who are subject to the power of government on some level acknowledge that the government has the right to have that power over them. It is the source or justification for the power of any given government. So in democracies, for example, legitimacy comes from the people chose their government. That is the whole point. You have to be elected to be in power. That's what makes you legit. In monarchies, usually you have to be like directly related to the king or queen that came before you, and that's why people recognize you as having valid power. The thing that's kind of cool about governments, or convenient anyway, is that we can often use our experience at school to substitute for thinking about power in similar ways. So you could think about like different teachers probably have different levels of legitimacy in your eyes. There are some teachers that seem to know what they're talking about. They seem to use their authority in a way that you respect. And so students tend to think of them as being legitimate. They have the right to tell you what to do because often they have a right reason, and often it's for your own good. These are teachers that often don't have to rely on a bunch of demerits to get you to do whatever they want you to do. You just do it because you recognize that their authority is valid. It's legit. So it's as perceived by the people who are subject to power. There are other teachers who, I'm sure I remember from high school, students tend not to respect as much. Teachers who tell people like what to do for no good reason or without ever specifying a reason tend to have less legitimacy in the eyes of students. Teachers who manage their classrooms by saying, okay, if anybody talks, everybody gets detention, right? That's like a little heavy-handed. Students tend not to like or respect that very much. Those teachers tend not to have a lot of legitimacy in the eyes of students. The next big concept, and again, really difficult, higher level concept, but through repetition and lots of examples, you will come to understand this, is ideology. Ideology sounds like the word idea, and for a very good reason. Ideology is a system of values and beliefs. And in a political context, those values and beliefs are about what is best for the state, that help explain how different governments behave. Ideologies guide government choices. What that means is, I'll break it down into each little part. It's a system of values and beliefs. So an ideology is composed of a bunch of like moral, ethical ideas that make sense together. They don't contradict each other. So like if human rights are important to me, and they are, then I would identify probably as being of a more liberal ideology, which I do. That means that human rights are important to me in pretty much every context. So it's not just, I think that women and men should have equal rights, but also I think that people of every race should have equal rights. I think that people should be treated equally. I think they should have an equal access to education. So it's not just one idea. It's a whole bunch of ideas that like clump together to make something coherent. And those ideas about what's right or wrong, or what the goals of society should be, help explain how governments act, why they choose to do what they do. Another very clear-cut example of an ideology that's, I think, no good is racism, right? Racism is a system of ideas with no basis in reality, but still, that govern the choices and the behavior of people who have racist ideologies. That was a lot. If you have questions, please send me questions. And in the meantime, I'm going to go on to this slide. So we've talked about like the basic building blocks of government, right? It's about power over people, land, and resources. And it's all about managing laws and money and protecting the population. Governments claim legitimacy on different grounds. They claim the right to rule on different bases depending on the kind of government. So like democracies are based on the will of the people. Monarchies are based on, I was related to the last king and here I am. And then ideologies are the ideas about what is right and good for society that help explain why governments behave the way they do. The last thing I'm going to throw into the mix is going to actually help you get set up to take notes tomorrow when we go over lots of different kinds of forms of government. But to start setting yourselves up, you can flip to a new page in an actual notebook. If you're using note cards, you can make one for unlimited government and one for limited government. If you're not a big fan of making charts, you can do this by color coding instead. So you can have like one color for limited governments and a different color for unlimited governments in your notes. That's totally fine. In any case, please set your notes up so that like what's showing up on the slide is at the very top because you're going to add a ton of detail tomorrow. So we've talked about governments, right, and how they're all about power. One way of thinking about governments is in terms of how much power they have. So you can classify every kind of government: monarchy, theocracy, dictatorship, totalitarian dictatorship, direct democracy, republic, parliamentary republic, any kind of system of government, into limited versus unlimited in terms of their power. Limited governments have limited power. They cannot just do whatever they want. In limited governments, the ruler's power is limited by law and by the individual rights of the people who live in the state. Often, these rights are written in a constitution. And in any case, in limited governments, the ruler has to follow the law and respect the rights of the people in the state, however they're defined in their constitution. They can't just do whatever they want. Unlimited governments are exactly what that sounds like. They are governments with no limits on their power to act. In unlimited governments, often one person, sometimes a small group, has full power with no limits to that power. The ruler does not have to obey laws. The ruler does not have to respect the rights of citizens. They can do whatever they want. Must be nice. You can add a little detail to this. We're going to go over all of this tomorrow, so you really don't have to worry about it in too much detail right now, but just to give you guys a preview, right? In limited governments, law helps control the leadership. You can't just do whatever you want. I can't wake up in the morning and decide that I don't like cats, so cats are illegal and now everybody has to get rid of them. No, I'm a dog person. So in these kinds of governments, everybody obeys the law. Nobody is above the law. There are documents or traditions that help state the laws, like the rules, right? Limited governments tend to protect citizens from being taken advantage of by the government or by anybody who gets access to power who might use it corruptly. And they usually include a system of checks and balances, which means that they don't put all power in one person, because absolute power tends to corrupt, right? Like power tends to go to people's heads. They usually have a system of distribution of power over different institutions. So in the United States, for example, we have a Congress and a Supreme Court and an executive, and they all have different powers. And in theory, at least, they're supposed to be equal when things are working normally. In unlimited governments, rulers do not have to obey the laws. There are fewer rulers. It's usually one person. Sometimes it's a small group. That's called an oligarchy. There are few or no personal freedoms or rights for the people in the state. Often the system of justice isn't very just by our standards. There's usually no trial by jury. And often government power doesn't necessarily stop just in terms of making laws. Often unlimited governments also take a stronger role in regulating and running the economy than limited governments, but we will get to that in a couple days when we study economic systems.